Imagine a Spanish galleon in 1570 crossing the Atlantic Ocean, heading northeast towards Seville. It is extremely heavy, so much so that its lower gun ports are just a foot above the waterline. In its hull lies silver, 300 tons of it, minted into coins at the Royal Mint in Potosí, packed in wooden chests and chained to the ship's ribs. Now imagine that same ship making that same voyage across the ocean every month. Then imagine it doing so for decades. Now imagine it traveling with 100 other ships, a fleet, a system, the largest recurring transfer of wealth ever seen between two continents. That was Spain's reality, and that was where its problems started. The name Potosí carries significant meaning. In 1545, Spanish settlers in the Viceroyalty of Peru, which is now Bolivia, discovered Cerro Rico, also known as the Rich Hill. And rich is not an exaggeration. From a geological standpoint, the mountain was almost entirely a pure silver deposit, unlike anything seen before or since. During its peak in the late 16th century, Potosí accounted for roughly 60% of global silver production. One mountain, one of mine. 60% of all silver in circulation. By 1600, Potosí had become a city larger than London, Paris, and Rome. Around 160,000 people lived at 14,000 feet above sea level, in one of the harshest environments on the planet, drawn there by the riches hidden within the mountain. Silver arrived in Seville, Spain's official Atlantic port, aboard the treasure fleets known as the floaters. The Spanish crown immediately claimed its share, the quinto real, or royal fifth, which amounted to 20% of all the cargo unloaded from those ships. For Philip II, seated in his office at the Escorial Palace in the Castilian mountains, it must have seemed as though God had handed him an endless blank check. He commanded the largest navy in the world. He controlled the largest army in the world. He ruled colonies across 4 continents. And across the ocean, a mountain was effectively printing money for him. He was the most powerful monarch on earth, clearly, indisputably. The sort of power that makes you stop questioning your own assumptions, because the proof of your strength is so overwhelming that doubt begins to feel like disrespect. That is precisely the kind of power that poses the greatest danger. This is how the rest of Europe saw the treasure fleets. To the Dutch, who were struggling for independence from Spain, despite having almost nothing, the English were a second-tier power whose queen had to keep close track of her courtiers' gifts. The French, who were constantly in debt. To the Portuguese, who had recently been forced to accept the Spanish crown despite their wishes, Spain seemed invincible. Spain appeared to have already settled the question. Spain appeared to be something to be tolerated and accommodated rather than opposed. Meanwhile, the silver inside the galleon weighed down the ship with each mile. Nobody was looking at the water. The first weakness was evident from the start, and it was economic. Spain was importing massive amounts of silver from the Americas, but its own productive economy, manufacturing, agriculture, and domestic industries was not expanding at a comparable rate. The money was coming in, but the things money is supposed to represent, output, created value, and goods produced by people, were not. What happens when more money competes for the same quantity of goods? Prices always rise. In 1550, Spain was the world's wealthiest country, and its people paid 3 times as much for bread as their parents had. The wealth was not flowing downwards, it was flowing outward. For 40 years, Philip II of Spain spent 12 hours a day at his desk. He personally reviewed every important letter and added marginalia to documents, which are remarks written in the margins in response to what he read. His marginal notes are still present, and historians have examined them. They are precise, thoughtful, and highly detailed. He corrected spelling errors in military dispatches and noted when a subordinate used the incorrect title or form of address. He paid special attention to the documents in front of him. Nonetheless, he ruled an empire spanning 4 continents. However, there was only one of him, and the day was still only 24 hours long. The Escorial Palace, Philip's base of operations, is located in the Castilian mountains, about 30 miles northwest of Madrid. Philip purposefully chose this location because it was remote, easy to defend, and away from the clamor and political tensions of the cities. He combined a monastery and a palace because he saw little difference between ruling an empire and serving God. and he planned to perform both functions from the same desk. Messages from the Americas took up to 3 months to reach him. Those from the Philippines could take an entire year. A decision Philip made on a military matter in Flanders, drafted in response to a dispatch, would take weeks to return, and by then, the situation would have changed several times. His desire to be meticulous was not unfounded. His mistake was believing that careful attention from a single desk could replace empire-wide judgment. The Dutch situation is a perfect example of this. The Spanish Empire included the Low Countries, which are now known as the Netherlands and Belgium. They were also the empire's most commercially advanced, densely populated, and economically productive areas. They generated massive amounts of tax revenue and had the best ports in Northern Europe. They were crucial. They were also Protestant, resistant to outside control, and increasingly frustrated by Spanish dominance. The Duke of Alba, Philip's governor, responded to opposition by forming the Council of Blood, which executed thousands and sparked a massive revolt. The Dutch struggle for independence took 80 years and cost Spain more than all the silver produced in Potosi. Philip personally received each and every message from the Low Countries. He closely examined them and made notes in the margins. By the time his decisions arrived, they had already been months late. Meanwhile, the Dutch were busy constructing the world's most powerful merchant fleet. The institution's paralysis was more than just a matter of pace. It was about the bottleneck structure. Philip never placed complete trust in anyone. His father, Charles V, ruled with the assistance of capable local administrators who had significant autonomy. Philip chose centralization instead. Every important matter needed to be brought back to him. And because he was both genuinely smart and genuinely prudent, his decisions were frequently correct, but they were always too late. He was the longest critical path within his own empire. In project management terms, he was the single point of failure in a system that lacked redundancy. When Philip was overburdened with paperwork, as he always was, the empire had to wait. Spain's adversaries didn't. The money was not actually helping, and that is the paradox. A government with endless silver has little reason to make reforms. Every inefficiency, every layer of excess, and every unnecessary office can be paid for because more silver is always available. The silver became the excuse that delayed every difficult choice. Why improve the tax system if the fleet is on its way? Why reorganize the army if you can simply hire more mercenaries? Why build domestic industry when everything can be purchased from overseas? The silver was more than money, it was a pain reliever, and Spain had relied on it for so long that it had lost the ability to feel the damage it was concealing. Let me explain what happened to Spanish prices in the 1500s. Between 1,500 and 1,600, the cost of goods in Spain roughly tripled, resulting in approximately 300% inflation over a century, with the steepest increase occurring in the latter half as large quantities of silver arrived. Today, this is known as the price revolution, and Spain was at the forefront. Once you understand the concept, the explanation is simple. Silver is not synonymous with wealth. Silver is used as a medium of exchange, and its value is determined by how much is available in comparison to the number of goods and services that can be traded for it. If the silver supply triples, while the supply of goods remains constant, each unit of silver loses value. Prices are then raised to reflect the new balance. Spanish economists at the time were aware of this. Martín de Azpilcueta, a scholar, first wrote about this phenomenon in 1556. They knew what was going on, but the silver kept pouring in. Here is where things become particularly risky for Spain, not just difficult in general. Spain's prices increased more quickly than those in neighboring countries because Spain was nearest to the silver source. Prices in Seville rose ahead of those in Amsterdam, and prices in Castile rose ahead of those in London. The result was a harsh economic imbalance. Spanish goods grew costlier than imported goods. A cloth producer in Spain, paying Spanish wages and facing Spanish prices, could not compete with a Dutch producer who benefited from lower costs in an economy that had not inflated as far or as fast. For a Spanish merchant, the rational move was to abandon cloth production and use silver to buy cheaper cloth from other countries instead. That is precisely what Spanish merchants did. Spain became a consumer nation. It shipped out silver and imported everything else. The effects continued to accumulate. Spanish industry, which included wool, textiles, and metalworking, began to deteriorate. Craftsmen who could no longer compete moved on to other jobs or relocated abroad, reducing Spain's productive knowledge and skill base over time. In Castile, farms were abandoned as workers moved to cities to work in silver-funded administrative and military jobs that paid in silver but produced no goods. By the end of the 1500s, Spain was importing foods from Northern Europe. Despite its enormous agricultural potential, the country imported wheat because silver made it cheaper to buy grain than to grow it at home. Potosí created an economic trap based on excess rather than scarcity. Too much of a single resource, misallocated, made everything else appear unnecessary until that resource was no longer sufficient. The bankers understood the situation better than the king himself. Since the early 1500s, Genoese bankers, along with the Fuggers in Germany and the major merchant banks of northern Italy, had been lending money to the Spanish crown in exchange for promised future silver shipments. As Spain's debt grew, the interest rates they demanded soared. Philip went bankrupt 4 times in 1557, 1560, 1575, and 1596, 4 bankruptcies in total. This was not due to a lack of silver, it was still arriving. It occurred because the promises made against future silver had outpaced the actual value of that silver. He had already depleted his future before it arrived. After each bankruptcy, the bankers renegotiated the debt under worse terms, recovered what they could, and lent again because the silver was still expected and the collateral was still valuable. They were not misinformed. They were simply assessing risk extremely accurately. Philip was also not misguided. He was trapped in a system with no way out. The Dutch had independently discovered what Spain had failed to comprehend, while Spain was financially exhausting itself in its conflict with the Dutch. The Dutch East India Company, or VOC, was the first joint stock company in history when it was founded in 1602. The Dutch distributed financial risk among thousands of investors rather than depending on royal silver to fund endeavors. They used efficiency in commerce to control trade rather than military might. They established a trading system that created wealth through exchange rather than taking money from colonies. While Spain used borrowed silver to maintain the status quo, the Dutch were developing a new institution and economic model to support it. By the time Philip II passed away in 1598, the Dutch were on their way to becoming the dominant commercial force in the world. Instead of using weapons, they overcame Spain by improving their understanding of wealth. By the late 1580s, Philip was dealing with a problem that couldn't be solved through paperwork or spending money. Under Elizabeth I, England had become a significant strategic threat. English privateers, particularly Francis Drake, targeted treasure fleets. English assistance was instrumental in the survival of the Dutch rebellion. Elizabeth had also executed Philip's cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, and was supporting Protestant rebels wherever Philip required peace and security. Philip responded with the most expensive military undertaking of the 16th century, the Armada. It included 130 ships and 27,000 soldiers and sailors. Its official mission was to transport a Spanish army into England, depose Elizabeth, reinstate Catholic rule, and eliminate the Protestant threat to his empire in the north. Philip named it the Enterprise of England. His fleet dubbed it Invincible. The strategy relied on perfect coordination between the fleet and the Spanish army in Flanders, which faced its own challenges and was led by the Duke of Parma, a brilliant commander who had warned Philip for months that the plan had major logistical flaws. Philip got Parma's letters. He examined them closely. He wrote his notes in the margins. However, his revisions were too late to be implemented before the fleet set sail. The Armada sailed in May 1588. The English refused to engage in the manner Philip had expected. Their ships were faster, lower in the water, and much more maneuverable, making them ideal for the type of hit-and-run fighting that the Armada's heavy galleons were not designed to handle. The English admiral, Francis Drake, had entered Cadiz harbour the previous year and burned the Armada's supply ships before it had even left port, an act so daring that Philip's advisors had initially said it couldn't be done. The Armada was never able to land its troops successfully. The meeting with Parma's army failed because Dutch flyboats dominated the shallow coastal waters, making it impossible for the Armada's deep-bodied galleons to enter safely. The fleet then retreated northward. Following that, nature accomplished what human fleets had failed to. Storms in the North Atlantic and the seas off Scotland and Ireland destroyed roughly half the fleet. 63 ships were lost. More than 5,000 Spanish sailors drowned or were killed after washing up on Irish shores. Spanish shipwrecks and Spanish sailors' bones are still being discovered on Irish beaches today. Philip, sitting at his desk in the Escorial, received the news with the restrained, disciplined sadness of a man who had convinced himself that this was God's will and was now having to reconsider what that meant. He didn't give up. Instead, he rebuilt the navy and dispatched 2 additional armadas in 1596 and 1597. Both were separated by storms before reaching England. No amount of silver in the world could buy a good wind. The English had learned a valuable lesson from 1588 that the Spanish had never fully grasped. A navy is more than just an army on the water. Naval warfare is a distinct field that necessitates different ships, tactics, and institutional approaches. England had designed ships that were better suited to the realities of the ocean than to previous generations' naval ideas. Spain had constructed ships designed to transport soldiers for a landing, floating fortresses that were effective for the strategy they were intended to serve, but were built for the wrong strategy. Philip II died at the Escorial in September of 1598. He spent his final weeks in the same rooms where he ruled throughout his reign. He struggled with gout and other illnesses. His death was prolonged, and according to contemporary accounts, he dealt with it with patience and resignation. He was not a cruel or foolish man. He was a ruler who believed that meticulous control at the center could compensate for flexibility on the periphery, that silver could be used to replace strategy, and that a divine commission relieved him of the normal pressures of economic reality. He was incorrect on all 3 points. He was, however, mistaken in the way that a deeply serious, highly intelligent person can be, methodically, comprehensively, and with perfect documentation. Poverty was not the root cause of Spain's decline. It resulted from being so wealthy that it could no longer act prudently. It believed that gold could replace strategy. No, it did not. And the story leaves us with a question that applies to both individuals and nations. What do you have in such large quantities that you no longer think about how to use it effectively? What problem are you funding rather than solving? And when does the fleet stop arriving?